Hello, my name is Alicia DeVrio, and I'm presenting work done with Motahhare, Eslami, and Ken Holstein on building, shifting, and employing power, a taxonomy of responses from below to algorithmic harm. Today, I'm first going to provide some background and motivation for our taxonomy. Then I'll describe how we developed our taxonomy, outline the taxonomy itself, and discuss some opportunities for researchers based on this. Algorithmic harm is the adverse lived experiences resulting from an algorithmic system's deployment and operation in the world. For instance, Amazon has algorithmically recommended groups of items expedient for poisoning oneself, which have been called suicide kits. This image shows some examples of problematic chemicals being recommended for sale together, and this highlights how severe algorithmic harm can be. Researchers have highlighted that we can't productively address these harmful algorithmic behaviors without centering systems of power. For example, the paper shown here argues for a more power-aware view, saying that we have not yet sufficiently centered issues of power. This focus is especially important because existing structures often fail to empower those who directly interact with and are affected by algorithmic harm. To see this in practice, let's return to the Amazon example. Families of those who bought and used these suicide kits have complained about Amazon's selling of these items. In acknowledgement, Amazon issued a statement expressing condolences and claiming to prioritize customer safety, but failed to stop the sale of the suicide kits. This highlights how people cannot always rely on powerful organizations to address algorithmic harm sufficiently of their own impetus. In response, people frequently adopt workarounds and counter practices to algorithmic harm. As these responses come from members of the public or others without direct power to make decisions about the design or deployment of algorithmic systems, we refer to them as responses from below. For example, Twitter users who noticed racial bias in Twitter's image cropping algorithm posted about it on Twitter and extensively worked together to test the racial bias. Shown here are screenshots of one of the more popular tests, testing side-by-side images of Obama and McConnell to see which would be prioritized. These responses can be effective in garnering power and working toward harm remediation. The Twitter users succeeded in causing Twitter to reconsider and stop its use of the image cropping algorithm, as shown in the article on the left, and Twitter's AI ethics teams subsequently opened access to the image cropping algorithm for public scrutiny, as shown in the article on the right. That being said, the structural disempowerment of actors from below can limit the effectiveness of their responses. For example, Elon Musk disbanded Twitter's AI ethics team after he took over the company, as relayed in the article here. So how can we better understand the ways that responses from below interact with power? What lessons can we draw from past responses to empower future action from below? We want to understand the ways that responses from below to algorithmic harms interact with power, so we developed a taxonomy that connects to existing theorizations of power. I'll describe our process for collecting and categorizing responses next. As I mentioned before, we understand actions and actors from below as those lacking direct power to control the design and deployment of algorithmic systems. And to emphasize power relations, we broadly refer to those who have control over algorithmic systems as algorithm lords, occupying positions above those subjugated by their decisions. And we acknowledge that relationships between people are much more complex than this fully captures. To collect cases of responses from below to algorithmic harm, we started with an initial set and expanded via iterative search of various resources, including research literature, news media, and social media. Cases spanned many algorithmic domains, such as recommendation, image cropping, and facial recognition, and many types of harm, such as financial, stereotyping, and surveillance. We included cases in which the system is described as algorithmic in the source material, the actor perceives harm from that system and takes action in response, and the response comes from below. We extracted and qualitatively coded responses from the cases we gathered, and then conducted a bottom-up thematic analysis with a series of interpretation sessions on these responses. In all, we collected and analyzed 96 documented cases from 75 sources with 169 embedded responses. We emphasize that we see the cases used as the basis for our taxonomy as illustrative of the phenomenon under study, but not necessarily exhaustive. And we see this work as an initial exploration and invite future researchers to expand on our taxonomy. More details about our process of response collection and categorization can be found in the paper. Based on this process, we developed a taxonomy. Our taxonomy describes the ways that actors from below respond to their encounters with harmful algorithmic behaviors. At its lowest level, our taxonomy contains responses. For example, in the case of Amazon's algorithmically recommended suicide kits, parents of users who have died by this method responded by suing Amazon. On the right is an image of one such recent lawsuit. In another example, much African population data is stored in servers outside the continent because non-African companies own a lot of the data infrastructure. This harms African governments and people by forcing them to cede full control of their data and furthering colonialist legacies, as detailed in the article in this image. In response, African governmental leaders are instituting policies to make these companies adhere to privacy regulations and pay taxes, aiming to shift some of the governance to themselves. This image on the right is a proposal for taxes in this vein. Our taxonomy then groups responses into types based on similar behaviors present. For example, these two responses help form the response type of pursuing legal avenues against algorithmic harm. In this response type, people attempt to leverage legal institutions in order to get an issue addressed. At the top level of our taxonomy, based on prior literature on power, our taxonomy synthesizes types of responses into 3 high-level strategies, each of which captures a different way that responses from below aim to interact with power. For example, we understand people's pursuing of legal avenues against algorithmic harm as pressuring, since in this type of response, people try to shift power away from those in control of algorithmic systems. When pressuring, people attempt to gain power over algorithm lords and get them to make changes. However, this pressure may vary in its degree of forcefulness, from punishing an organization with negative PR to convincing an organization by flagging issues for them to address to forcing a company with new legal requirements. I'll describe the other 2 strategies in our taxonomy now. Here's another example of response. A user of Google Images conducted a search for images of a wedding. After finding the results harmfully skewed with a heavy Western bias, as you can see here, the user responded by switching terms and instead searching Indian wedding. In a second example, a TikTok user watched videos recommended to them on TikTok's For You page. When a video popped up that the user found harmful, violating part of their LGBTQ identity, the user found and selected the Not Interested button. These 2 responses help form the response type of mitigating individual algorithmic harms. In this response type, people respond to algorithmic harm by adjusting their own behaviors to change how the system works in a particular circumstance, without fundamentally changing how the algorithmic system works as a whole. And we understand this type of response as protecting, since in this type of response, people employ their own abilities to shield themselves from the harms a given system foists upon them. When protecting, actors respond from below to directly affect their own or others' capabilities. And these responses fit into repair politics and more immediately improve the experiences and abilities of disempowered people. For instance, the Google image user conducted new searches, routing their experience away from harmful results without affecting the algorithmic system's behavior. And similarly, the TikTok user tried to remove harm from their view using a built-in platform affordance, something already within the logics of the algorithmic system. And now for the third and final strategy of responding to algorithmic harm. In one example, a smart streetlights program in San Diego, smart streetlight shown here, troubled those who would potentially be surveilled as a result and had not been consulted. In response, people dedicated significant effort to reading documents related to the program. Shown on the right here is an image of some of their marked up notes on a City of San Diego white paper on the smart streetlights program. In a second example, users who encountered potential racial bias in the Twitter image cropping algorithm, like I mentioned earlier, responded by conducting tests of their own and gathering evidence for and against varying hypotheses that they had developed. These 2 responses help form the response type investigating potentially harmful algorithmic behaviors further. And we understand this type of response as strengthening, since these investigations primarily help responders build power. When strengthening, people build up their reserves of power, enhancing their future abilities to protect or pressure. Strengthening can help people understand the scope of the harm they've encountered, determine what should be done next, and gain perceived legitimacy. For example, the smart streetlights responders used what they learned to refine their arguments and ensure use of language legible to those they engaged with. And Twitter users responding to racial bias used their testing and hypothesizing to determine the extent to which racial bias was occurring and build proof that they used to push Twitter for change. Additionally, strategies can be fluid and overlapping, meaning types of responses can fit into more than one of these 3 power dynamics. As just one example, protesters in China created hundreds of duplicate videos of protest events by mirroring, cropping, and filtering them to evade algorithmic censorship. Responses like this form the response type refusing legitimate engagement with harmful algorithmic systems. Some responses from below do this by providing false or unexpected information to harmful systems, and this fits into existing conceptualizations, including data poisoning and obfuscation. This response type both protects and pressures. These responses can be protective by obscuring personal data and behaviors of actors or others, and by allowing actors to continue to employ their own abilities. And these responses can pressure by rendering algorithmic systems inoperable as intended. Now that I've outlined our taxonomy, I'll briefly discuss some challenges and related opportunity spaces for the FACT community to better support disempowered actors and their responses to algorithmic harm. While our work has shown the potential of responses from below, it's crucial to consider the burdens this can have on actors. For example, many types of responses burden responders with translation work of some kind, such as trying to convey the legitimacy of information about algorithmic harms to those with greater power. Ideally, everyday people's concerns would be valued by default, but given the reality, we see opportunities for the FACT community to collaborate with everyday people, to elevate their complaints to ensure they are heard and acted on, to recast what they have already been saying into forms that will be appropriately valued by those with more power, and to proactively shape what forms of knowledge and evidence are understood as legitimate by powerful actors, such that responses from below are valued as they are. Additionally, though responses from below can help remediate algorithmic harm, they can also have less desirable effects. It's challenging to anticipate what impacts a response might have down the line, and while it's difficult to identify and eliminate future adverse impacts, we see opportunities for the FACT community to create tools aligned with principles of restorative and transformative justice, making them more difficult to redirect toward harm, to work toward a world in which consent and refusal are equally viable options, as refusal can preemptively avert harm, and to consider their own agency and when it might be most beneficial to not design, to not deploy, or to declare insufficient and retract. Finally, the specific contexts of algorithmic systems present unique obstacles to the success of responses. And for some, entire categories of responses might be infeasible. For example, one response we observed involves leaving an algorithmic system, which is not feasible for some, like rideshare drivers, whose livelihoods are attached to the system. We see opportunities for the FACT community to work to improve legal protections and rights of those responding from below to algorithmic harm, and to reframe the idea that algorithm lords or others with systemic power and expertise retain control throughout the deployment of an algorithmic system. Please check out the full paper for more details, and I'd love to chat more about this and talk about questions or thoughts you might have. Again, I'm Alicia DeVrio, and thanks for listening.